So, hello. Today I'm going to do a little bit of a podcast around a topic that has been quite a hot topic for a very, very long time in board gaming. And I've been thinking about it for a very long time myself. And with my most recent activity in actual role playing, which has increased like tenfold, especially during the pandemic, of course, I would like to tackle the question of what is a role-playing game in a box? Because this is something that comes up quite often when a new game comes out. It says, well, there's a lot of narrative and it's all storytelling. And then everybody will jump on it and go, is this a role-playing game in a box? And I find this question always quite intriguing. And I think it's, sometimes I get the feeling that it's a certain age group that asks this question, which is my age group, or maybe up to 40 years old. And above. Obviously, I'm 47. Because I think that these people probably remember a time when they were doing role-playing games and now, for reasons like family commitments, etc., cannot do that anymore. And so they would like to recreate the feeling and the atmosphere that they were experiencing at the gaming table back then when they were playing a tabletop role-playing game, but in a box. Because getting together a role-playing group can be quite challenging. And while board gaming is already very nerdy and niche, role-playing is even more nerdy and niche. I think it has improved with the onset of people playing on YouTube, and it's become quite a lot more popular these days, and probably we've lost a lot of our street cred in terms of, we all worship demons and we summon them and we're all crazy people and we kill people and then drink their blood. But I think it's still very niche. So, the question of what is a role-playing game in a box, I think depends very much on what you think a role-playing game is. And I don't want to go into the very different definitions of what a role-playing game is, because there are plenty of definitions of role-playing games. There is the theory that says, okay, there are different types of role-playing games. They can be gamist, they can be narrative, they can be simulationist. The GNS theory or description, which you can read up on Wikipedia. Then there are other ways of defining them. But I think we all have, those of us who ask the question, is this a role-playing game in a box, have our own idea of what we consider a role-playing game and what kind of experience we would like to get from that thing in the box. So, but for those of you who may not be as familiar as I am with the subject matter, or as people who have played role-playing games and are now looking for a role-playing game in a box, maybe I'm going to give you a couple of key points. Most role-playing games, and I really mean most, I'm not saying all, usually let you impersonate a character, the role that you take on. That can be a particular person who's got a name, an age, maybe even a background, and usually some kind of mathematically derived version of themselves, which we call the statistics, or stats for short. Sometimes you will also hear the word stat block. These stat blocks summarize what the character can do to what degree. Sometimes it will also tell you what the character cannot do. So, for example, most role-playing games can express a person's ability to lift things and to push things using a statistic called strength. Some of them also have things like charisma, so maybe the ability of, making people interested in oneself, convincing them, being able to socialize with people, that kind of thing. And some role-playing games leave it at that, and especially in the old days, and we're now coming full circle because the old days are now the new days, where people actually want to go retro. In the old days and in the retro games, quite often you only have those attributes: strength, charisma, intelligence, wisdom, you name it. And whenever you are put to the test by the story, you have to determine whether or not you can overcome the challenge that's being put to you. And you do this by usually rolling dice. The dice that you roll can be very different from system to system. So for example, the Gumshoe system uses D6s. Of course, D&D uses 1d20. Then there was the D20 system itself, which came and went. It's still available, obviously, you can still use it, but it didn't become that big thing that everybody thought it was going to be. TDE uses 3d20. The World of Darkness uses d10s mainly, and then huge dice pools. You also have huge dice pools in games like not Blade Runner. I keep calling it Blade Runner. Shadowrun. So basically, this is what you do. You take dice and you roll. Then there are those games, especially the Star Wars game from FFG, that use generic sets of dice where you have symbols which represent certain outcomes, and then you have to read from a list what these symbols mean. But what you do is you bring in fate, as it were, in the form of dice to determine if you are successful. In order to bring in something like an external referee. Because obviously when you play a role-playing game, in most cases you have a storyteller who will act as a referee, but sometimes the storyteller really needs to call upon the fates to make a decision whether or not you have been successful. And that's where randomization comes in using dice. Then what you also have is in the more modern games, quite often character interaction, which is really important, so that you don't have just single characters trying to work through a story, but you have the group that works together, bringing their different skills, or sometimes they have the same skills. It doesn't say anywhere that the characters in a group, in a party, have to have very different skills. It does help sometimes, but it's possible to play with an all-mage group. They may not be very good at pushing things over the cliff edge, but they may be able to levitate them. And then, in most games today, you also have things like the character's background. What is their motivation? What do they want from life? What do they contribute to life? What has life done to them? And these can then be taken by the storyteller and woven into the story to build the universe that the characters inhabit and to flesh it out and to make the story that's being told a lot more relevant to the players and to their characters. So that's how I would define a role-playing game. You have a role that you play, you have some form of character sheet that explains what you do and what you can do and what you can't do and how good you are at things that you do. But you always have the role-playing aspect where, for example, you don't just go, oh yeah, I'm going to convince this guy that I want the keys to the castle and I roll on my charisma. That's not how this works. You can try, but for example, most DMs these days will just go, yeah, let's do this properly, and we'll ask you to roleplay it and to come up with ideas. And even, like have a conversation with the guy who owns the keys and see if you can convince them. And of course, if you're doing a really marvelous job with the whole convincing side of things, you may get a bonus on your roll, or the roll may be removed from the whole interaction entirely, and you just succeed because you are just a brilliant player who is impersonating this particular character really brilliantly. So when we think of these things, then we can see that we have two sides as well in the game. We have the game master, the storyteller, or actually I should say we have three sides. We have the storyteller who knows the story and who knows what the story points are that need to be hit in order for the story to come to a conclusion. Because usually you will not just play open-ended and just sit there and just sit in a sandbox and just throw little spades at each other. You also want to go somewhere because people usually want to experience a story. That story can be very, very epic. It can go on for years, Or it can be a really tiny story, like kill all the rats in the cellar and rescue the princess in the process. But there has to be something that's going on. And you can also say, okay, there is something going on, but I'm not telling you, and you have to find it out for yourself, which is also a very interesting type of role-playing experience, but it depends on the players. Then the second thing that you have is the story, which comes with impressions of where you are, of how things smell, of what you can do, of what you can see, what you can hear, and how it feels. And then you have the third part of the triangle, and that is the player characters, who may be very, very statted. So there may be a lot of derived abilities that they have. So in the old days in D&D, you only had like your basic attributes. The same goes for TDE, for example. But today, you have all kinds of other things. You have derived abilities like insight. You have feats. You can do all kinds of things. And this can go on forever. I mean, there are gaming systems like, for example, Rollmaster, where it is just totally intricate. The stuff that you can do with your characters and the amount of time it even takes to create one is incredible. And you can tweak your character. And it's almost like the actual game is happening outside of the game, quite a lot like the Lord of the Rings LCG by Fantasy Flight Games, where it's a deck construction game. And actually the most part of the game happens outside of the game because you're trying to construct your deck. And in those role-playing systems, you're trying to construct a character and you try to optimize it. And now when we look at these ingredients and we think of board games, then of course there are some that come to mind quite quickly. Of course, the Dungeons and Dragons board games like Legend of Drizzt, Castle Ravenloft, etc. They are derived from D&D 4th edition, and they are based on it. And you have your normal characters that you would find there. You have your abilities, you have treasure. You have the monsters that appear as well in D&D. And they have stats. Your characters have stats. You can even increase your level. So you gain experience. That's also a hallmark of quite a lot of role-playing games. You increase your experience and then you become better. You level up. So here we definitely have a role-playing experience in a box. Plus, you can play it without a dungeon master because the dungeon master is replaced by a deck of cards that basically works as your AI. Then, of course, there are those games that represent all three parts of the triangle. You have a dungeon master, you have the story, and you have the player characters. For example, Descent First Edition and Second Edition are like this. With regard to, you could also make an argument for Doom, the board game, to be a role-playing game in a box, because you have the dungeon master. There isn't that much of a story, but there is a mission that people have to go on, and you have your stats on your soldier's record card, and then you just play through it. You have abilities, you have skills that you can use. You could also argue for Gears of War, where you have an AI that drives the story forward. There the story is pretty much go in, kill everything that you can find and get out at the end, but that's still a story. And as such, it's no different from a lot of dungeon crawl role-playing adventures, which are basically, oh, we don't care why there's a red dragon in this particular dungeon. Let's just go in, kill it, and get its treasure. And in these, you have the most basic, I would say, but most basic doesn't mean not interesting or boring type of role-playing game, where the story is told in a very, very linear fashion, and where you just basically follow a particular path. Sometimes you have an intelligent opponent, for example, in Descent, that also has the ability to thwart your plans and use their own mind against yours. And sometimes it's an AI, which of course is a lot less able to react to what you might come up with, and that also limits your interaction. But of course, even in games like Descent, the whole social aspect doesn't really enter into it, because there is no such thing as you have an NPC that you're trying to convince. You have to use your wits to overcome a non-combat challenge, because basically it's, even in Descent, you try to get somewhere, there are monsters, you kill them. Which brings me to the other part of role-playing games, and that is a lot to do with building the world together. Not maybe having a straight line, not having a straight path that you need to follow. Maybe even making decisions that will alter the course of the whole game. And there we do have examples as well. Probably the most famous one is Gloomhaven, which of course is a legacy game. And it does a couple of things. Number one, your decisions influence what you can and can't do. And you alter the gaming components, hence the legacy thing, by, for example, placing stickers on a map, by taking cards, tearing them up when the time comes. And it's got a huge dungeon crawl component with a lot of very tactical fighting, which a lot of people really enjoy because it makes you think. You really have to plan, and a lot of people don't like it because of that. So here, you also don't have a person that guides you. There is no dungeon master. It's an AI, but the AI is a lot more dependent on what you do. And by making decisions, you open up courses down certain avenues, but you may also close avenues that go in another direction. So they are a lot more, I would say, closer to simulationist games where the world exists and keeps moving, and your decisions within the world may shape the world, but also in such a way that certain areas of the world are made available to you and accessible to you, but some of them may be closed forever. Another game that is a lot like a role-playing game in a box is, of course, Kingdom Death Monster, which basically tells you that's what it is. And I've got it and I've played it. I haven't played it excessively because it is a lot to do. It's a lot of bookkeeping because what you essentially do is you build a little bit of it's a community that you build in a hostile place where you are meeting monsters, and there you also have the storytelling aspect that certain things happen. Then you get to read from the book what these mean. You can discover things like language, etc. And these are abilities that your tribe, your community get, and they will help you advance. But at the end of the day, it is life and the struggle for survival in a very, very hostile environment. There is a lot of fighting in there and of course the miniatures are a very, very important part of it. Lots of miniaturists actually just buy the game because they want to have the miniatures. Of course the miniatures are important, yes, but I would actually, if I were to play it again, I would just not go down the road of building them all because I have no skill in that. I didn't even particularly enjoy it, although I built a lot of them, and I painted 2 or 3 and I really loved those. But I think you can play this game just as well with coins or chess pieces, because the fighting is important, yes, but having the miniatures that represent, it's like a tabletop game. Having those, tabletop war game, I should say, having those miniatures that represent what people are wearing, the type of armor they have, etc. You can do this. You can get the minis and they will have those sets and you can just put them together. But it is a lot of work, and it is for people who really, really enjoy this. I'm more of a gamer and less of a miniaturist, so for me that didn't hold that much interest. But of course, that is also a role-playing game in a box. It's also a civilization building game. It does have its critics, mainly also because of some of the depictions of the female body. I do understand this, I do accept it, but here I have to say that the game behind it is way too good to ignore. And if you don't want those minis, the ones that they are mainly talking about are minis that you would get as additional things that you buy. You don't have to get them. The game itself is really sound and it's very, very complex, and it does achieve a lot. But you do have to have you do have to play a long game, because that game will take ages. It's like a campaign. Then, of course, when we look at this, there are also other games that could fit into this idea of a role-playing game in a box. For example, the Lord of the Rings LCG by Fantasy Flight Games, because there you have characters, they have stats, you have abilities that you can play, or things like weapons, etc. But you have them in the form of cards, and you draw. And the probabilistic statistical relevance comes in not through die rolling, but through getting cards from a deck that you have pre-constructed. And then, of course, you have the story that's being told by the deck, which is the event deck, where you get your monsters from and the environments that you pass through, etc., etc. That's a very, very minor role-playing game experience in a box, but I think it does tick some boxes here or there. And then, of course, my all-time favorite is Roon Bound 2nd edition, where you also have a character, they have a stat block, and then you just walk through the environment and you basically encounter monsters and you try to kill them. It is super basic in what it does, but for some reason it gives me great joy when I play it, and it's one of my go-to games, and I just completely enjoy it. It is probably because it is quite simple, because it's very quick to set up, and it is just very immersive, although the board isn't very interesting, the minis aren't very interesting, but for some reason, it is just something that I always come back to. And it does make it possible for me to immerse myself. And I think this is also a very important hallmark of role-playing, and that is immersion. You become part of the story. The story isn't just something that happens to other people. It's not like Risk, where you're sitting there, or Monopoly, where you basically see the little meeples passing by you. But you are in the middle of it. So, do I believe that there are role-playing games in a box? My answer is yes, but it really depends on what you want from your role-playing experience. If you're out for a dungeon crawl, you have a plethora of possible games you could play. For example, Descent, 2nd edition. There's a 3rd edition coming out, which I believe is completely app-based. You also have this Lord of the Rings thing that Fantasy Flight Games brought out. Is it called Adventures in Middle-earth? I don't know. But that's pretty much a dungeon crawl with an outdoor world. You have Doom. You have, if you are more into space opera, you have the Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars game, which is exactly like Descent. It's a Descent clone. It works the same way. You also have, which is out of print, but which is one of my all-time favorites, although I've never even managed to finish successfully finish the first mission, and that's Gears of War. I think it's an incredible game. I really love it. If you are more into legacy games, and if you don't mind making the game not replayable by changing its components, of course you have Gloomhaven. If you are in for the long haul and you're willing to invest quite a lot of money, of course you have Kingdom Death Monster, which is pretty much a dungeon crawl as well, because it's all about killing the monsters, going on the hunt and then finding the monster and then killing it, with a lot of role-playing elements in between. One could also make an argument for Pandemic, the legacy games, which are role-playing games to a degree, because they also tell a story. You also have roles. They may be very generic roles, but still, and you tell a story as you go along, and you actually also interact with the world. You're trying to stop a pandemic. And then, of course, there are smaller games that one could put into this category. When we think of a little bit more like the choose your own adventure thing. So, for example, the Sherlock Holmes Crime Cabinet series, where you basically try to solve criminal cases, that could be considered a role-playing game in a box, where you take the role of the investigator. You don't have stats, you only use your brain, so your character is only as smart as you are, but it does have a lot of investigation to it, which is a little bit like Call of Cthulhu should be. So for those of you who like Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, those might be of interest. Then there are more recent games that I've not played, but I've seen played, called Undo, where you basically are faced with something that has happened and you're trying to undo it. And you draw cards and you can make decisions based on those cards. It's a storytelling game, but it is definitely quite strong in some areas of role-playing, namely the interaction, because you played with other people and you're trying to come to a conclusion of how to undo what has happened. So, for example, there may have been a murder and now you're trying to undo this murder, and then you try to, go back in time. So you get the chance to go back in time and then change reality, as it were. Then, of course, there is Time Stories, which I believe does meet the basic definition of role-playing game that I've given. So you've got characters, they've got stats, abilities, things that they can do, and there is a story. But the twist is that you get to replay the story a couple of times to become better each time, each run. And the story is quite immersive. One game I was so annoyed with because they changed the mechanics halfway through because they ran out of game, which I really didn't like. But mostly the games that I've played or the games that I've watched played are really, really good. So that would be a role-playing game in a box. Very much a choose-your-own-adventure, also with the caveat that you cannot replay it. But that's pretty much a role-playing experience as well. If you get a pre-written adventure and you play it with your group, chances are that the group will not want to, so pouring some more coffee here because it's quite early in the morning, that the group may not want to go through the whole adventure again because you do know the twists and turns. You do know where, if it's a dungeon crawl, where the traps are. You do know what the boss monster is, etc. I still have not found an adventure or a game in a box that represents or recreates the more narrative games. So, for example, the way I play Vampire the Masquerade is so narrative. I could not get this from a box. Also, the way I play Call of Cthulhu would be very difficult to do. But that's just the way I play, because it's all character play, because that is something that you will not be able to get from a box. And that is the interaction between the characters. You can do it basically by the by at the table, but then of course you bypass the board game, because the board game cannot capture or react to this, unless of course you play, for example, Descent in such a way that you as the game master give the players the ability and the possibility of acting in character and then making choices on the board for them. This is something that you could do, but not out of the box. So there you would again have to have a role-playing background that we cannot really expect people to have when we present them with a board game. There is also a game called, and I forget what it's called, but Chrissy on Flying Solo does have a playthrough of some of it. Then there is Killforth, of course. I wouldn't consider that a role-playing game, at least not from what I saw, because it was very It didn't really tell a story, in my opinion, but then again, I didn't play it. But I can really recommend, depending on what you are into, to check out some of the dungeon crawls. The more narrative, really immersive, engaging storytelling events that you will come across at a role-playing table will probably be a lot more difficult to reproduce. And I don't have examples. So if someone here listening to this knows of games in a box that represent or recreate this whole social interaction aspect of role-playing in a box, then you should post this, because some people might be interested in this. Okay, so I wish you all, a good 2021. For most of us, I hope it'll be better than 2020. Lots of us have gone through lots of terrible things, COVID and non-COVID related. For those of you who are still struggling, we're thinking of you. And I wish all of us a peaceful and healthy 2021. Bye.